Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving deep into adverse impact,
Oh, yeah.
or AI for short.
Okay.
And you've shared a chapter with us
Yeah.
from the book Adverse Impact: Implications for Organizational Staffing and High-Stakes Selection
Right.
by Guinness and Smith.
Yes.
And this is going to be a really thought-provoking one.
It really is. This chapter goes deep into how, seemingly objective hiring practices can sometimes have unintended consequences,
Yeah.
especially those using cognitive ability tests.
Okay, so for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with this topic,
Sure.
let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly is adverse impact?
Mm.
And how do we even know if it's happening?
So at its core, adverse impact occurs when a selection process, like
Yeah.
a hiring test,
Yeah.
unintentionally disadvantages individuals from protected groups,
Okay.
such as racial minorities or women.
Yep.
It's not about intentional discrimination,
Right.
but rather about identifying statistically significant disparities in outcomes.
And there's that 80% rule that gets thrown around a lot.
Right.
How does that fit into all of this?
So the 80% rule is a guideline used by federal agencies here in the U.S.
Yeah.
to flag potential AI.
Okay.
Basically, if the selection rate for a protected group is less than 80% of the selection rate for the group with the highest rate,
Okay.
it raises a red flag and warrants further investigation.
So let's say 90% of male applicants pass a test,
Right.
but only 60% of female applicants pass.
Yeah,
That would trigger the 80% rule
exactly.
because 60% is less than 80% of 90%.
Exactly. And while this rule is a useful starting point,
Yeah.
it's essential to remember that it's just one piece of the puzzle. We need to consider other factors,
Sure.
including sample size and statistical significance,
Right.
to make a truly informed judgment.
Now, we know cognitive ability tests are often used in hiring
Yeah.
because they can predict job performance.
Right.
But they're also a common source of adverse impact.
Yes.
Why is that task?
That's the paradox. While these tests can be effective predictors,
Mm.
they often result in different average scores for different groups,
Okay.
which can lead to those disparities in selection rates that we've been talking about.
So it's not necessarily that the tests themselves are intentionally biased against certain groups,
Right.
but more about the outcomes they produce.
Right. And it's not just about the overall scores either.
Okay.
A test can appear unbiased overall,
Yeah.
but when you dive deeper into specific score ranges,
Okay.
things get really interesting.
This is where Guinness and Smith's research on those 3 test score regions comes in,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
They argue that the location of the cut score,
Right.
the point that separates passing from failing, can have a huge impact.
It's huge.
And not always in the ways we'd expect.
Exactly. They break it down into region I,
Okay.
low scores, region 2, middle scores,
Yeah.
and region 3, high scores.
Got it.
And each region can present unique challenges and unexpected consequences.
All right, let's break this down.
Sure.
What happens in region I?
So what's fascinating about region I is that both groups might actually perform better than their low test scores would predict.
Okay.
However, because we're dealing with low schools overall,
Yeah.
the test becomes less selective.
Right.
We're letting more people through.
So more people are passing the test.
Yeah. And while this might seem like a good way to reduce AI,
Okay.
organizations might find that the test loses its utility,
What does that mean?
meaning it doesn't help them effectively identify the best candidates for the job.
So aiming for region I to avoid AI might actually backfire
Exactly.
in terms of finding the right people for the job.
Yeah.
What about region 2,
Okay.
where we're looking at those middle-of-the-road scores?
Region 2 is where things get really tricky.
All right.
We often see one group overperforming and the other underperforming relative to their test scores.
Oh, wow.
Plus, this is where those pesky false positives and false negatives start popping up in significant numbers.
So like someone passes the test but doesn't do well on the job,
Exactly.
or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Okay, last but not least, region 3.
Yes.
The high scorers.
Right.
What unexpected outcomes show up there?
Now, you might think that focusing on high scores would be the safest bet.
Yeah.
But even region 3 has its surprises.
Okay.
In this region, we sometimes see both groups performing worse than their high test scores would suggest.
Huh.
It's also where AI tends to be most severe.
This is all starting to feel like navigating a minefield.
Yeah.
You think you're taking a step in the right direction, and then bam,
Right.
you run into another unforeseen consequence.
It definitely highlights the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
To illustrate these complexities further,
Okay.
Guinness and Smith present 2 case studies in their chapter.
Perfect. Let's dive into those case studies. So these case studies, What kind of scenarios are we looking at here?
So the first case focuses on what they call intercept-based differences.
Okay.
This basically means that the groups differ in their average test scores, but show similar relationships between scores and actual job performance.
So, like, Group A scores 5 points higher on the test on average.
Right.
But for both groups, a higher test score translates to better job performance.
Exactly. Now, the intuitive solution to reduce AI in this scenario might be to lower the cut score,
Yeah, that makes sense.
letting in more people from the lower scoring group.
Okay.
But what Guinness and Smith found is that this can have some surprising
Oh,
and even counterintuitive effects.
like what spill the tea?
Well, first of all, even with a lower cut score, they found it was really difficult to hit that 80% rule target.
Huh.
And on top of that, lowering the cut score actually led to a slight decrease in average job performance for the minority group.
Wait, so trying to make things more fair actually ended up hurting the very group they were trying to help?
In a way, yes, it seems counterintuitive,
Yeah,
but it highlights the complexity of these issues.
for sure.
Plus, they also saw a significant increase in false positives.
Oh, no.
People who passed the test but didn't perform well on the job.
So lowering the cut score might not be the magic bullet solution we'd hoped for.
Right.
What about the second case? Did they try something different there?
Case 2 gets even more complex
Okay.
because it involves both intercept and slope-based differences.
Okay.
This means that the groups differ not only in their average scores,
Yeah.
but also in the relationship between their scores and actual job performance.
So a high score for Group A might predict stellar job performance.
Right.
But the same high score for Group B might not be as strong of a predictor.
You got it. And this makes figuring out the right cut score even trickier.
Oh, wow.
Guinness and Smith found that even with significant adjustments to the cut score, they couldn't get anywhere near that 80% rule target.
So are they saying it's basically impossible to use these tests without running into adverse impact issues?
Well, they do argue that given the typical characteristics of cognitive ability tests
Okay.
and how they play out in these different score regions,
Yeah.
hitting that 80% target, while maintaining the test's usefulness in selecting qualified candidates, is extremely difficult.
So if lowering cut scores isn't the answer, what are we left with?
Hmm.
It all feels a bit hopeless.
Not at all. It just means we need to think beyond simple solutions and really grapple with the complexity of this issue.
Okay.
Guinness and Smith suggest exploring alternative approaches to selection that might be less susceptible to these biases.
Like what? Give us some ideas to chew on.
Well, for starters, we could consider using a wider range of assessments that go beyond just cognitive ability.
Yeah.
Things like personality tests, work samples, or simulations that focus on specific skills and behaviors relevant to the job.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I've taken some of those personality assessments.
Yeah.
And they can be really insightful in terms of understanding how someone might fit into a particular work environment.
Exactly. And instead of relying solely on test scores, we could put more emphasis on a candidate's experience, past performance, and even their potential.
It seems like the key takeaway here is that we need to move away from this idea of a single magic bullet assessment.
Right.
And instead think more holistically about how we evaluate candidates.
Absolutely. And while those cognitive ability tests can still have a place in the process, we need to be mindful of their limitations.
Right.
And potential for unintended consequences.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this complex topic.
It is a very complex topic.
But it's clear that awareness is the first step towards creating a more equitable hiring process.
It really is. And it's not just about avoiding legal trouble.
Right.
It's about creating a system that's genuinely fair.
Yeah.
And gives everyone a chance to succeed.
Because at the end of the day, we all benefit from a more diverse and inclusive workforce.
Absolutely. And what I find so compelling about Guinness and Smith's work is that it challenges us to move beyond those simplistic solutions and really engage with the nuances of this issue.
So for our listener who's grappling with these challenges,
Sure.
what are some key takeaways they can apply in their own organizations?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say it's crucial to be aware of the potential for adverse impact in any selection process. Don't just assume that because the test is widely used or seems objective that it's automatically fair.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
You might think you're doing the right thing, But without careful consideration, you could be perpetuating inequalities.
Exactly. And beyond awareness, it's crucial to analyze your hiring data regularly,
Okay.
looking for any patterns that might suggest adverse impact.
Like what kinds of patterns?
Are certain groups consistently scoring lower
Okay.
or being selected at lower rates?
Yeah.
Those are red flags that warrant further investigation.
And if you do find evidence of adverse impact,
Yeah.
don't panic.
Right.
It's
Right.
not necessarily a sign that you're doing something intentionally wrong.
Exactly. It's an opportunity to learn, to
Right.
reassess your processes, and to explore alternative approaches that might be less susceptible to bias.
I think this whole conversation really highlights the importance of staying informed
For sure.
and continually educating ourselves about these issues.
I couldn't agree more. The world of work is constantly evolving,
Right.
and our understanding of fairness and equity needs to evolve along with it.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, we leave you with this. If you're involved in hiring decisions in any way, remember that building a truly equitable and inclusive workplace requires ongoing effort,
Yes.
critical thinking,
Mhm.
and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into adverse impact.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing